fentanyl is killing more than 70,000 Americans a year. Big, you got it. So let's launch a major surge to stop fentanyl production and the sale and trafficking with more drug detection machines, inspection cargo, stop pills and powder at the border.
As President Biden calls on the U.S. Congress to work with his administration to tackle America's opioid crisis, Republican lawmakers accuse him of not doing enough to stop fentanyl smuggling from Mexico. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. Republicans in the U.S. Congress are blaming the Biden administration for drug smuggling at the U.S.-Mexico border and the recent surge in fentanyl-caused deaths, with Mexican drug cartels increasingly manufacturing this lethal opioid for the U.S. market. The chemicals used in the production of fentanyl are imported predominantly from China. According to the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency, most of the illicit fentanyl sold here in the U.S. is smuggled across the southern border. Fentanyl is an illicit synthetic opioid that has caused the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans. Last year alone, it is 50 times more potent than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, over 150 people die every day from overdoses related to synthetic opioids such as fentanyl. Overdose deaths involving synthetic drugs in 2020 were over 18 times more than they were in 2013. In recent years, deaths from fentanyl have reached record levels. In 2021, around 90% of the 80,000 opioid-related deaths in the U.S. involved fentanyl, creating a public health crisis and a political flashpoint in Washington.
Biden can try to deflect on the border crisis his policies have caused. I will remind the president that since he took office, there have been nearly 5 million illegal crossings at our southern border, and fentanyl deaths are surging.
But can the increase in fentanyl deaths be traced to illegal immigration at the U.S.'s southern border and what many Republicans in the U.S. Congress call Biden's open door policy? Joining me now is the former director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, Jim Carroll. He was the Trump administration's drug czar. Director Carroll, as you know, many Republicans in the U.S. Congress are blaming the Biden administration for the surge in fentanyl-related deaths. The problem, though, didn't happen overnight, did it? Is it fair to blame Biden and Democrats for America's growing opioid crisis?
Sadly, this crisis has been going on not just for years, but really decades. And this is the latest of what we're going through with this fentanyl crisis. It's just the latest iteration of what has been a problem in America for years, too many years.
You say it's been going on for too many years, but why then do we see so many lawmakers on Capitol Hill essentially playing football with this issue instead of focusing on the real issue, which is the growing demand that is fueling the production, the sale, the trafficking of fentanyl?
It's a great question, and it's really a twofold answer. When I was the director, the number of fatalities in the U.S. was in the 70,000s. Now, sadly, we're over 100,000. Probably 107,000 Americans died of either a poisoning or an overdose. And I think those are two separate issues in the last 12 months. And so what we're seeing now is an even deadlier drug, a deadlier poison than ever before. And sadly, what we're seeing is what appears to be more of it brought into our country. But it's not an immigration issue. What we have is a surge of fentanyl coming across the border. What we need to do is make sure we're focusing on the issue of stopping the drugs at the border. And it's not necessarily a people issue, an immigration issue. It is a control issue of being able to know what's coming into our country.
Many Republicans, though, as you know, are conflating illegal immigration and drug trafficking at the border. The evidence doesn't support their narrative, does it? Because if we look at the facts, over 90% of drug seizures are made at legal border crossings and entry points into the United States. It is, in fact, Americans who are bringing in the drugs, not illegal immigrants.
It's both. It certainly is Americans. The drug cartels are powerful. They have an amazing amount of money, and they have an amazing amount of resilience of being able to encourage and pay Americans to do this. So what the drug cartels are going is they're going to American cities along the border, paying people who are suffering from an addiction, paying for them to go south across the border and then come north smuggling drugs in. But you're absolutely right. It's at the ports of entry.
But you say paying people. No, it is paying American citizens.
Yes.
For the most part. So blaming it on illegal immigrants is disingenuous, isn't it? Because, again, looking at some of the key facts here, just 279 out of the 1.8 million arrests made by Border Patrol of people trying to cross the border illegally into the United States resulted in fentanyl seizures. That's 0.02%.
Of the immigrants, absolutely. But American citizens are going to Mexico. American citizens are bringing it in. But so are people who are coming into the country that are not American citizens. But absolutely, at the end of the day, the American demand for drugs is pulling these drugs here.
And every U.S. administration has had to deal with this problem, Democrat and Republican. If there hadn't been such a growing demand for these drugs, would we have seen this growing production, sale, and trafficking?
I think what we're seeing is the rise of a completely different drug, a drug that is almost instantly fatal for most people. We're seeing so many teenagers who are dying when they think they're taking something else. They think they're taking something for anxiety. They think they're dealing, with their issue by taking a pill that they don't understand. And so what we're seeing is a drug that back in the 70s and in the 80s and the 90s and even the early 2000s would not have been fatal, but now the demand is for something even more powerful, more poisonous, and what we're seeing is just this wave of Americans that are dying who are taking something.
And does the U.S. administration have the right strategy, the right approach? Because, again, should there be more focus on the demand side of the equation? You have children, and anyone with children here in the United States and elsewhere in the world is really anxious about these type of synthetic drugs and opioids falling into their hands inadvertently.
Absolutely. When I was the director under President Trump, we actually spent more money on the demand side than we did on the supply side of stopping the illegal bringing in. We spent more money on addiction, treatment, and prevention. And I'm happy to see that President Biden is continuing that. When I was in office, it was the first time in 29 years that we had a reduction in the number of fatal overdoses. That was because we did everything.
There was a 4.6% drop.
Correct. First time in 3 decades. And that was because we were helping people with treatment. We were helping educate our young people about the dangers of what's out there. And we were doing everything we can to work on the supply side of this as well.
But the overdose deaths surged again.
Yes.
In 2019.
They surged again in 2019 and 2020 as COVID was coming into the U.S. That's when it surged.
So we heard President Trump, under whom you served, say all of the right things, obviously campaign as well on this issue, because drug overdoses were such a big issue in the 2016 campaign in some of the battleground states. In fact, he said, quote, at the time, "We are going to stop the inflow of drugs into our country 100%. But the actions that he took while he was in office didn't really match the rhetoric, even though there was that drop for a little while in overdose deaths. What he tried to do, and it's been widely reported, is sideline and defund your own office, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, didn't he? He contemplated a 94% cut in its budget.
Yeah, that was disappointing. I'm not going to kid you. And when that came up, I immediately talked to the president and talked to the others about what was doing it. The president was not going to stop his efforts. He had been told by the financial advisors to move it to HHS, our Health and Human Services, and to move it to our U.S. Department of Justice. By doing that, I convinced the president that took the power away from the White House to be the convener, to make sure that both the treatment side, the people who were working on the demand side, were working in conjunction with law enforcement.
And so we hear politicians then always say the right thing,
right,
say what voters want to hear, but when they're in office, not really act on it. The Government Accountability Office, in one of its reports, concluded, quote, ONDCP did not issue a national drug control strategy for either 2017 or 2018. So clearly the Trump administration, despite the rhetoric, did not prioritize this issue. So Republicans saying the Biden administration isn't doing enough just really doesn't cut it, does it?
The policy is a document. And historically, the first year of every president never released the report. When I got there, 1 year later, we worked on the report and we then issued it. Now the law has changed, and actually they don't have to report it the first year of a president's term, because they realize that everyone is just getting started, and they realize that it's a bit foolish to try to do a complete plan without really understanding both publicly, but also understanding from the national intelligence section about exactly what's going on. So now they've amended the law to make sure that it actually reflects reality.
And of course, America's history of drug abuse, which, as you said, goes back decades, also brings in all of these other factors: mental health, social policies, but also the racial biases in the legal system. Over 50 years ago, when President Richard Nixon launched the so-called war on drugs, not only did it not achieve its stated aims, but it also laid bare these racial biases in the legal system, in the sense that you had black kids being thrown into jail for smoking pot at a much, much higher rate than white kids for doing cocaine. Something is fundamentally wrong, isn't it?
It is fundamentally wrong. And that issue is one that has concerned me for a while. And sadly, it's one that we're continuing to see today. Really, I think what it has taken in the last couple of years is for children who are in areas of our country that are typically have a very high ratio of minorities that are being killed, literally killed by these drugs more so than any other community in the United States. And imprisoning someone because they're smoking pot, because they have an addiction, is wrong. It is the wrong approach.
But yet, are American politicians learning the lessons of the past? Because hearing President Biden at the State of the Union, he intends to do just that, to double up on punishing those who are caught in this drug abuse system. And when you look at African Americans, back in the 1990s, they were sent to prison for drug offenses 13 times more than others.
I would like to think that President Biden understands, especially since he's had a child that has struggled with this issue, that there are two different types of people in this. There are people that have an addiction. Those people need treatment. They need compassion. They need to get back on their feet. We need stable housing. We need stable employment for them. But sadly, there are people, and this is what I hope President Biden was referring to, their addiction is to trafficking. Their only addiction is to money. They don't have an addiction. They're intent on bringing this into these communities. Sadly, so many of these communities are minorities, but they have no addiction to drugs. They are strictly in it for the cash. Those are the people that we need to target. The people that have an addiction, they need our help.
But are we seeing continuation of these policies that, at the end of the day, target these minority communities? You look back at John Elrickman's statements back in the mid-1990s, and he was a senior advisor to Richard Nixon. He said at the time that the war on drugs started as a racially motivated policy to criminalize black communities. Has that changed?
I really do think it has changed. I think it has changed in the last several administrations of the United States, where they are intentionally making sure that we are diverting people who have an addiction to get help, and the people that are strictly trafficking to law enforcement. But we cannot punish people, regardless of the color of their skin, regardless of where they are coming from. We cannot punish those people for an addiction. That is both inherently wrong, but it's morally wrong. This is a disease. We've recognized addiction as a disease 50 years ago. We need to start treating it like the disease it is, and putting people in not just to treatment, but good treatment.
Calling it a war on drugs, was that the wrong approach?
It certainly should be a war on drug traffickers, and it certainly should be a campaign for good for treatment.
What got you involved? How personal is this for you?
So I started my career as a criminal prosecutor, and I started my career mainly prosecuting people for drug offenses. I understand some of the facts that you were just saying. My world changed when one of my own children became addicted, started with a prescription to opioids, and I realized what's really happening, that it's not just someone else's family, it's my family. That's when I decided to put down everything else I was doing, focus on that then, and now it is still the heart and soul of what I do today, is helping these communities.
What worries you more? Is it the illicit drug trafficking or the prescription drug side of it?
Oh, the prescription side of it, I think, really has been fixed. I really do think that under President Trump, we reduced the number of opioid prescriptions by about 35%. I think President Biden is continuing that. So I think we're okay on the prescription side, but we still need to get more people into treatment while we're reducing the supply, because if it's not on the streets, we have a greater chance of getting them into treatment. But in terms of what do I worry about most, it's sort of like saying you have two children, who do you love more? In this case, I worry about both the same. This is what drives me every day to work with people that are trying to do the right thing.
Jim Carroll, drug czar during the Trump administration, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for talking about this important issue.
Thank you. Meanwhile, a group of 116 Republican lawmakers on Capitol Hill wrote a letter to President Biden demanding his administration take immediate action to eradicate the production and trafficking of fentanyl. In the letter, they wrote, quote, Joe Biden's open border policies have allowed criminal drug networks to flood the United States more easily with fentanyl. And now, enough of this lethal drug has flowed across our southern border to kill every American 7 times over.
Strides alongside our partners to address the significant drug issues around the border, particularly with respect to fentanyl, and seizing record levels of that before it enters the country. In fact, since August of last year, Customs and Border Patrol agents have seized more than 20,000 pounds of fentanyl. It's an ongoing effort. It's not something you can ever take your foot off the gas on, and we're going to continue to do that as well, and that will be certainly part of the discussion down in Mexico City.
And I consider fentanyl to probably be the most dangerous controlled substance we've ever had to deal with. Even heroin users who are expecting to buy heroin are instead buying fentanyl, and they're not aware of it. And for a drug abuser who might know, okay, this is how much heroin I can withstand, they don't know how much fentanyl they can withstand. So that's why they're experiencing overdoses or experiencing lethal doses.
As Republican members of Congress called for the classification of fentanyl as a Schedule I drug, others urged the president to take action against China, which they said is, quote, the principal source of the precursor agents from which fentanyl is produced.
美方应尽快取消对中方有关机构制裁，停止抹黑中方禁毒努力，同时永久整类列管芬太尼类物质，以负责任态度解决国内芬太尼滥用危机。
But can U.S. lawmakers blame America's growing opioid addiction on foreign countries? And how does the U.S.'s fentanyl consumption compare to other countries? Between 2018 and 2020, the United States was among the top consumers of fentanyl worldwide, accounting for almost 18.5% of the world's total consumption. According to the CDC, over 82% of all opioid overdose deaths in 2020 involved fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. So can the U.S. simply blame drug cartels for its alarming opioid crisis? Should Washington's failed war on drugs, which was started over 5 decades ago by President Richard Nixon, focus more on the demand rather than the supply side of the problem? Joining me now to discuss this is Gil Kerlikowske, Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection from 2014 to 2017. He also served as the Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy between 2009 and 2014 during the Obama administration. Gil Kerlikowske, we might not have heard about fentanyl 10 years ago, but America's drug problem has outlived every administration, Republican and Democrat, over the last 60-plus years. What would you like to see happen differently? What should the strategy really focus on?
Well, I'd go back to, I certainly don't disagree with enforcement, increased penalties, particularly if they're focused and targeted on the people that are trafficking, that are making the money. But I would go back to an earlier statement and tell you that we need a very well rounded health education in all of our schools that help young understand the dangers of drugs. And if we can reduce the demand, if we can do a better job of preventing drug abuse, we're not only going to save lives, we're going to reduce the costs to society, the huge cost to society that addiction has presented.
When you served under President Obama, you considered the term war on drugs to be counterproductive. Has the U.S., though, changed its fundamental policies, even though it no longer actively uses the term?
One of my first interviews with the Wall Street Journal after being confirmed by the Senate in 2009 was to say that we need to end this and stop calling it a war on drugs. The reporter decided to check on me and make sure that my other colleagues, former law enforcement officials, because I've been a police chief in Seattle for 9 years, called a number of law enforcement officials to say, well, what do you think about this statement that we shouldn't call it a war on drugs? All of the chiefs that he talked to came back and said, no, we're not going to arrest our way out of this situation, and to continue to call this and deal with this as a war on drugs rather than more of a public health problem. They agreed with that.
But what is happening today, though, is that many lawmakers in the U.S. Congress are seeing this as an opportunity to go after immigration and asylum seekers. In 2021, though, U.S. citizens made up more than 85% of convicted fentanyl drug traffickers. That's 10 times more than the number of convicted illegal immigrants for the same offense. Is there enough will among members of Congress and in the White House to address the real issues, rather than scapegoating illegal immigrants to win votes at the next election and blaming countries, whether it's China or others?
Well, we've seen this rhetoric quite a bit. Illegal immigrants stealing jobs from Americans, illegal immigrants entering the country and bringing drugs in, et cetera. And as the research and the data and your own statement just really show, that isn't the case at all. We're responsible for our own problems. We also have 3 decades of Congress failing to deal with any type of comprehensive immigration reform. And I would certainly think that we're not going to see it in the current Congress.
You mentioned Congress's failure to deal with the immigration issue. Another side of this is prescription drugs. How much worse will this opioid crisis get when you consider the mental health issues that drive it, the prescription drugs business that fuels another important aspect of it? How much worse does it get before something fundamental is done to change things?
Well, one thing that we have seen in the last year or two is the beginning of a plateau, of a flattening. Given the skyrocketing number of deaths, there's a little hope there. The other, of course, important part is we've kind of come out of COVID. And when we saw so many people isolated, so many people being confined to their homes, being out of work, those are the kind of things that also drive people or direct people to using or abusing drugs. I think we're starting to kind of see a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel on that.
Gil Kerlikowske, former Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection and former Director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.
The history of opioids in the United States is long. Up until 1912, heroin was found and regularly prescribed in medicine. The very first federal law to control the sale of drugs, the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act, was enacted in 1914. But its primary purpose was more to collect taxes than to control opiates. It took another 6 decades for the U.S. government to realize it was dealing with very serious problems. That is when President Nixon launched the so-called war on drugs, based on 3 pillars: eradication, interdiction, and incarceration. Whatever its true purposes were, this war, too, failed. In 2015, the Drug Policy Alliance, an advocacy group opposed to the war on drugs, estimated that it had cost $51 billion per year. By 2021, some estimates put the price tag at $1 trillion. Costs aside, the criminalization of drug use has also been regarded as a policy disproportionately targeting African Americans, according to the American Civil Liberties Union, which in 2001 suggested that, quote, the number of black men in prison already equaled the number of men enslaved in 1820. And so, in short, the drug problem facing the United States is deeper, more complex than opioid abuse in many other countries, and not only because of its scope. It is intertwined with its own history. And all signs suggest that some politicians, tenors of the Republican Party, would rather continue to play politics by blaming illegal immigration for the new influx of fentanyl, rather than seek to find solutions to a societal scourge. After 6 decades of a failed war on drugs, during which demand for and trafficking of drugs shot up, social policies to curb demand might be more effective than eradication, interdiction, and incarceration. Or worse, blaming illegal immigration and foreign countries for what is America's own homegrown drug quandary. From me, Ghida Fakhry, and the team here in Washington, thanks for watching.